well, what kind of messages are we sending our kids about why we use the drugs that we use? And even if that's alcohol and we're saying, oh man, I had the worst day at work, I just need a drink. Or we're going to grandma's house for Thanksgiving and there better be enough wine because this is going to be a long day. The message we're sending our kid is, I have this emotion I don't like. My answer is to drink at it, but I'm really concerned about the messages we send our kids about why we drink or why we use weed or why we smoke cigarettes. And if we could start looking at that, then that'll go a long way toward helping us think about the whys that our kids might be using and having conversations about that why specifically.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Paula Faris Show. I'm your host, Paula Faris, and I'm laughing because my husband, John, joins me today. And we have tried to record this intro for today's conversation about 6 times. And I think we're going to nail it right now, aren't we, John?
They say it's the 6 times a charm. Isn't that a saying?
I think it's the 3rd, but hey, 3 times 2 is 6. John, I think you're going to nail this, though. What is this Sunday? And you got to tell all the guys out there that are listening.
Well, the reason I know is because I have a calendar invite for myself the Monday prior to Mother's Day, just to remind myself that it's coming and I need to order myself a gift.
Order yourself a... Oh, I was like...
gift for you.
I was like, yeah, that's messed up. I can't ask you that with I like the element of surprise, but I'm not a big fan of flowers. I'm acts of service. I like nice things.
No flowers coming your way.
Thank you, honey. I appreciate that. John, we've had some really great conversations. Talked a couple of weeks ago about the number one reason why your kids should play youth sports.
We got a ton of feedback from the public, that's for sure.
We did. And people like to see you in your coaching element because you do coach basketball. So it's nice to see you in another element. And then last week, you weren't part of that conversation, but you were definitely part of this moment in life. We're talking about the sandwich generation and what to do when you're caring for your kids and your parents, which you've been a really awesome partner with everything that's going on with my parents. So I just want to say thank you.
You're welcome.
And a reminder, if you want to take these conversations a little bit further, make sure you're signed up for my personal newsletter. You can sign up at paulafarisofficial.com. It goes out every 2 weeks. John, you are a loyal subscriber.
Yes, I am.
Aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And supporter. That's right, babe. Okay, so let's jump into today's conversation. And this one is something that is going on in so many of our homes right now because it's prom season, or we have kids coming home from college, or we're getting ready to send them off to school. And the conversation is this. It's one that you have requested months ago. You wanted to talk about teen drinking and substance use, and also whether or not you should provide a safe space for your kids to drink in your home. And John, I took my first sip of alcohol when I was 5 years old. I still remember it distinctly. Sat on my dad's lap, gave me a sip of his beer. It was so good. But because I never saw my parents abuse it in the home, and I knew their why, as you just heard at the beginning of the episode, their why was just to enjoy it. They didn't necessarily need it. But for you, a totally different background. And I like that we're coming at this whole topic from 2 different perspectives. You didn't take your first drink of alcohol till you were in your 20s, right?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't something that was even around in my household. And I think it really stems back to my grandfather. So my father's father, he was an alcoholic. And in fact, he died of alcoholism. I never met him. My father told me stories of my grandfather that actually found him on the side of the road, passed out, and he actually died of, alcoholism, and he just drank himself to death. So it was something that my father never drank. And so it wasn't something that we just really ever did in our household, not because we thought it was right or wrong or because it was legal or illegal. It was a choice that my family made, and since I never really saw it around the house, it was never really much of a temptation for me.
Yeah. So again, we're coming at it from 2 different perspectives, and I wanted to invite an expert on the subject into this conversation. Her name is Jessica Lahey. She's a recovering alcoholic. She's been researching this specific topic, especially how it impacts the adolescent brain. She's been researching it for over a decade. She's written 2 best-selling books, one called The Gift of Failure, the other one called The Addiction Inoculation, which she's going to reference quite a bit in this conversation. But I really think that because, John, you and I might have some different perspectives, and we know other couples, close friends, this is a real tough topic to dive into in their homes because they have different stances on whether or not they should provide a safe space for their kids to drink. So I really encourage anyone out there, even if it's an ex-partner, listen to it with your partner. It can get that conversation going. And these are really important conversations we have to have in our home.
They are. And being proactive about these conversations. If you don't have them ahead of time, they're going to come up and you're probably not going to be prepared for how to handle them appropriately.
Right. So without further ado, here's our new friend, Jessica Lahey. She is answering all of your questions about teen drinking and teen substance use, whether or not we should provide a safe space for our kids to drink, and what's actually happening to the adolescent brain. She's also going to be busting some myths in the process. Jess Lahey, thank you so much for joining us and talking about what we think is a really important conversation and a topic that so many parents are trying to figure out right now, and that's drinking and substance abuse in our tweens and teens. So, and I want to introduce you to my husband, John. John, Jessica.
I'm so excited to be here. It's a tough topic, and anytime anyone's willing to broach it, I'm just really happy.
Yeah. We're at this time where we're entering the summer. A lot of kids will be coming home from college, or they're at that age where they're going to be going off to college, and their parents are going to say, well, I'd rather have them drink in a safe space, or it might be prom season. Maybe we just start out with, why is this your mission? I was telling John about you and what you've done. And you're an author and a writer, and you speak on this topic. You refer to yourself as an alcoholic, and you're a recovery coach. So why is this your mission right now, Jessica?
I am in recovery. When I sort of got to the point where I really knew I needed help, one of my first thoughts, sort of after I freaked out and went to my first meeting and cried and all that stuff, was, oh my gosh, I come from a long line of people with substance use disorder. My husband has people in his family with substance use disorder. I'm looking at my 2 children and I'm thinking, how do I make this stop with me? Like, is it inevitable that they're going to end up having to go down the path I did? Or, what's the deal? And I wanted a book that was really best practices for parenting and substance use prevention. And I just couldn't find exactly the book I wanted. So I was very lucky and I got to write it. And so while I'm really thrilled about all the other work I've gotten to do, this is the topic that really, I feel like I was born to write and talk about. It makes what I had to go through as a kid worth it.
You've been sober how long now?
10.5 years. Yeah.
That's incredible.
It is.
My sober date is my mom's the day after my mom's birthday. And that is not a coincidence, because I got blackout drunk at her birthday party, which 0 out of 10 do not recommend.
Do not do that.
No.
John, you and I had different childhoods. So, John and I were both raised in very, conservative, strict, fundamentalist homes. Both of our parents were strict. John, what was the stance on alcohol in your home growing up?
I don't know if it was a stance, but it just wasn't something my parents did. Like, neither one of them drank. So I never saw any alcohol in our house. It just wasn't much of a conversation. Didn't really think about it. They were off doing their lives, and our kids, we were involved in sports, and we were just very active kids. So it wasn't even something that we really talked about, because it was almost invisible in my household. I don't know if that was by design, but that's essentially how I grew up. It wasn't a large temptation for me.
When was the first time you had a drink?
I wasn't even exposed really till probably in college. And I actually can say I never drank underage. So it wasn't until I was like 21 years old where I went to, I had one of those,
statistically speaking, you were automatically set up to, and there's some confounders in the statistics, but the younger a kid is when they have their first drink or first drug, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. So for example, if a kid is in 8th grade, which, believe it or not, if a kid is going to use drugs or alcohol, the average age of initiation tends to hover somewhere around 13 and a half, 13.7, depending on the state. So that if an 8th grader first tries drugs and alcohol, they have almost a 50% lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. If we can get them to wait 2 years, then it drops by over half. It goes down to 21%. And if we can get them to wait another 2 years until they're a senior in high school, it goes down to like 11%. And as I mentioned, there are some confounders there, but at the same time, that doesn't happen until the early to mid 20s. So you automatically although not talking about alcohol at all, not such a great thing, but the fact that you were able to, put off your first use until later is really, really was great for your brain, and it was great for your statistical risk for developing substance use disorder.
I'm really fascinated by the science of like the adolescent brain versus the adult brain with substances, but I'm going to throw a little wrench in this conversation because I distinctly remember taking my first sip of beer when I was 5 years old, and I was sitting on my dad's lap, and he gave me a sip of it. And yes, I grew up in a really strict home. So this was kind of paradoxical. Like, it didn't make much sense. I had to wear skirts to my knee. I couldn't wear two pieces. We couldn't go trick or treating on Halloween because it was devil's holiday. Like, I grew up in a really strict home, but my parents drank, but they never took advantage of it. So when my dad gave me that first sip of beer when I was 5, I enjoyed it. And they always offered it to me, even when I was underage, but I wasn't super interested. And then even when I started to drink, I really never took advantage of it. And I was never tempted by drugs or anything. And I don't know, is there a theory out there that, like, because it wasn't so taboo, that's kind of my theory. And I kind of feel like that with my kids, but I think the three of us are going to have like maybe some differing opinions.
No, that's great.
Research and the data.
Yeah. So if you want to talk about substance use and substance use prevention, you have to have some comfort with gray area because, like I said about the statistics, right? So partially, genetics comes into it. Kids with parents who, or first or second degree relatives who have substance use disorder, they are, they're a genetically higher risk for developing substance use disorder. It's about 50 to 60% of the risk picture, whereas the other 40 to 50% is your environment, adverse childhood experiences, that kind of thing. There's this idea that if you give your kids sips, that somehow it inoculates them against, going crazy when they go off to college and go to their first kegger or whatever. The evidence is exactly the opposite. That number one, the younger a kid is, the higher their risk. Number two, you can't teach a kid to be a moderate, like you can't teach me to be a moderate drinker. No matter how many times I watch someone else be moderate around alcohol, I can never learn that. So for people who are wired for substance use disorder, teaching them moderation is not really a thing. It just it doesn't work. Well, it's the same thing with like, oh, kids are going to do it anyway. So I might as well take everybody's keys and they can do it in the basement. Yeah. And there's a lot of problems with that one too. Number one, your kid, that's a permissive stance on drugs and alcohol, and your kid's risk of developing substance use disorder during their lifetime is higher. Number two, if you're doing it with your kids' friends as well, you're raising their risk of substance use disorder as well. It just doesn't work. Like, I get why people want to do it. They want to keep their kids safe. They want them to sort of see, to somehow, protect them from going crazy when they go off and first encounter alcohol. But those methods do not work. The research is really clear on that. They just don't. It's parents with a really consistent and clear message of, no, not until your brain is done developing. And here's why. Okay. And here are the real numbers of who's drinking and who's not. When that kid in 8th grade says to you, oh, it's no big deal, everybody's doing it. If your kid knows that's not true, that it's only 24.7% of 8th graders admit they've had more than a sip of alcohol by the end of 8th grade, then your kid can say, that's not true, and be a little bit more empowered to, if they don't want to have some of that beer, to say, no, that's all right.
So let's say you are a parent and you're trying to keep your kids safe from, getting into substance abuse. Are there signs you're looking for? Are there things that you can do with your kid to kind of see, hey, are they experiencing this? Are they dabbling with this? Are they hiding this from me? Like, how can you broach that conversation with a 13 to 18-year-old who lives in your house still?
Look for change. This is sort of the global answer for any of those things, and positive and negative change. So let's say you have a kid who normally sleeps really well and they stop sleeping really well, or a kid who normally is an okay eater and suddenly they stop eating. Or in the opposite direction, let's say you have a kid who's usually pretty, has been low and suddenly they're really happy. Instead of looking that gift horse in the mouth, you have to start thinking, my kid's been really, really low, and all of a sudden they're kind of a little bit happy, a lot happy, maybe a little too happy. What's going on there? So change is sort of the universal answer to that question of, how do I know if my kid's in trouble in any sort of mental health area?
That's really good. How rampant is this? This was a listener question from Rachel. She says, is it more common than I realize? And then I was reading in your book that it said teen drug addiction is the nation's largest preventable and costly health problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us how rampant it is.
Well, there's great news. First of all, substance use prevention has gotten so much better. Like the program I went through when I was in high school actually raised my chances of starting to use drugs and alcohol. Yeah, that was the early iteration of DARE. DARE raised kids. The early iterations raised kids' chances of using
DARE
substances.
To keep kids off drugs.
Exactly. Yeah, it did not work. Just say no doesn't work. Scared straight doesn't work. All of these things don't work. Well-intentioned, but they don't work. So now that we're getting better at it and we're actually using evidence to fuel, these programs and to inform these programs, substance use in adolescence has been going down for the past decade. There was a bit of a plateau just pre-COVID, and then during COVID, things got a little bit crazy. Generally speaking, we're still on this downward trajectory. It's fantastic. However, between ages 19 to 30, it's going up in specific areas, cannabis use, alcohol use, and especially some of the laws during COVID changing, like, suddenly you can get takeout cocktails or you can have cocktails delivered you can get booze delivered to your house. That has been a big driver of adult drinking going up. And a lot of kids saw their parents drink a lot more during COVID, which was a real problem as well. But generally speaking, things are headed in the right direction. The answer to your question is fewer kids use drugs and alcohol than you might think, which is good, which is great. But the problem is we tend to overestimate. We as human beings, we're really bad at this whole estimating how many people are using and how invested they are in having drugs and alcohol around. We tend to overestimate it. This is a thing called pluralistic ignorance. And when we do that, we tend to adhere to the perceived norms. So for kids, like if you were to ask your kid in college, how much does your roommate drink? They will not only overestimate how much their roommate drinks, but they will overestimate how important having alcohol around is for their college roommate.
Oh, part of their experience.
Right. And so the problem is that perception can become reality, right? And especially, for example, if someone you would look up to, like the president of a frat or the team captain on your soccer team, if you believe they're drinking more, you are going to be more likely to raise your level of drinking to match theirs. And that's a problem. So that's why giving kids really good information about how many kids are actually using is great, because then that helps them say, oh, no, this isn't true. Not everybody's doing it. And, it's different at different levels, different grades, that kind of thing. I said in 8th grade, it's 24.7. By the end of high school, really only 65% of kids have used within the last, say 30 days. So it's nowhere near what people think. I almost didn't put a college chapter in the addiction inoculation because I'm like, why would I bother? Everybody drinks in college. Turns out that's not true either. The vast minority of college students drink the vast majority of the alcohol consumed on campus. The heaviest binge drinkers drink 71% of the alcohol consumed on all college campuses. So, and then there's huge groups of people who don't really drink at all during college. So we need to ratchet back and give kids really accurate information around A, what it's doing to their brains, the fact that it's much more damaging during adolescence, and B, that not as many people are doing it as they might think.
Okay, let's talk about the A. What is it actually doing to their brains? Because how these substances, and we're talking about weed and alcohol, drugs, vaping, all of this. I don't know about vaping so much, but how does it impact an adolescent brain as opposed to an adult brain, like John's brain and my brain?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the adolescent brain, so from puberty until the early to mid 20s, is extremely plastic, meaning that it's much more susceptible to influences from the outside, positive and negative, right? If you're introducing chemicals into the brain that are glomming onto the receptors that are normally, like, for example, we have receptors in our brains for cannabinoids in our body because we create cannabinoids in our body, but at nowhere near the levels that you can get if you're vaping or smoking or using edibles for weed. So we're glomming up those receptors. We're changing the chemistry of the brain. Our brains crave homeostasis, which is like the same level, everything's good at the same level all the time. There's a fantastic book called Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke that talks about this. Our brains crave homeostasis. And when they don't get it, they have to do all kinds of things to try to get it back, which detracts from the normal growth and development that they have to do. So, for example, for cannabis, in a kid who uses cannabis on a chronic basis, meaning more than twice a week, they're much more likely to have a smaller hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the seat of short-term memory formation and consolidation. There's a reason that, there are those jokes about people who smoke weed having short-term memory loss, because it's true, because those receptors are right there near the hippocampus.
And this is permanent damage? Is this permanent?
Short-term and permanent. Now, the magic of the brain is that if a kid stops, that there is still the ability to rewire. Like I said, there's huge plasticity in the brain. The brain is a really magical place. Don't get me started on adolescent brain development. I love that topic so much. There's a lot of rewiring that can happen even into the 20s and almost up to 30 that, we can fix things if things get broken in there. But ideally, what we want is for the adolescent brain to develop unencumbered by having to deal with that stuff. Because the more connections the adolescent brain makes, the better off that brain is going to be as it gets into that final phase of development.
Yeah, so that's how you would answer. Yeah, Jenna had a question about it's just weed. It's the just weed culture.
No, and see, I get this question all the time. Yes, weed is addictive. Yes, weed does short-term and permanent long-term damage to the brain. And the nice thing is, if you know your kid really well, like if you know your kid and not like the kid you wish you had or some imaginary version of the kid you think you're raising, if you know your kid, then you know their levers or like the inflection points for your kid, what your kid's goals are. And you can say to them, look, you want to be a doctor, you want to be a nurse, you want to be a whatever, you're going to need your short-term memory for that. And weed is going to do short-term and long-term damage to that, the way your brain stores memories. And you need that. You're going to need that moving forward. So the more you know about your kid and the more you know about their goals, the more you can use those goals to talk to them about the short-term and long-term damage that alcohol and drugs do to their brain. And alcohol, for example, is more dangerous in an adolescent than it is in an adult, because adolescents, number one, don't feel as impaired and as the exact size and gender adult. They just don't. They're a lot more likely to say, no, I'm good. And therefore probably more likely to get in the car and try to drive, that kind of thing. They're also less likely to feel the negative after effects. So less likely to get that little oof, maybe I shouldn't do that again kind of thing. And then on top of that, adolescent girls, we have less of a particular enzyme that we need in order to break alcohol down. So given all else being equal, which it's not because our body composition is different, girls are going to get drunk faster on the same amount of alcohol that a boy would for a couple of different reasons. But one of them is this enzyme thing. That's true. And they're more likely to get drunk faster. And they're also less likely to understand how impaired they are. That can be really dangerous.
Yeah.
We have another question from Robin. What would you say is the biggest difference between substance abuse today in 2024 versus maybe the 80s or 90s when we grew up?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. I talk about being in recovery all the time because it's so important that we get rid of the shame and the guilt around this. There's so many amazing women who have written, especially women. I mean, men have too, but women in particular, because women, and especially women who experience anxiety, if you drink and you are a woman who experiences anxiety, you're actually more likely to have to develop substance use disorder than not when anxiety and alcohol goes together. So there are all these amazing women talking about women and alcohol and the dangers of women and alcohol. Shame and guilt has been taken away a little bit. There's like sober January and all that kind of stuff. People can say,
we did dry January.
Yeah, we did.
People are at liberty now to say, you know what? I don't think I have a problem with alcohol, but it just doesn't make me feel great. So I'm going to take some time away from it. And that's like a completely cool thing to do. There's so many more options for non-alcoholic beer and cocktails, and, restaurants are coming up with whole non-alcoholic food pairing. I mean, there's so many options now and things that we're allowed to talk about now that I feel like, when I was growing up in the 80s, we just weren't really allowed to talk about it. I had a parent who was an alcoholic, and it was a forbidden topic. We were not allowed to talk about it. And with my kids, I encourage them to talk about it as often as they want. Use me as an excuse for why they don't use, drink, whatever. That's fine with me.
As a follow-up to that, Julie said, I'm hearing that this next generation is not drinking. She said, wouldn't that be great? And you do, as you just said, a lot of people are sober curious, and it might not be because it was in their genes. They're just sober curious. I feel like John is kind of leaning in that direction a little bit more. Like he'd love to eventually cut it out of his life completely. So can you talk about this sober curious movement and this next generation, maybe not even wanting to drink so much?
So there has still, I just want to point out, there is still an uptick in 19 to 30-year-olds in both cannabis use and psychedelic use. So, but there's also some really interesting, psychedelics are a whole other topic we don't have time to talk about today. But there is that uptick in 19 to 30-year-olds, and that may or may not, prove to be a long-term problem. We're just not sure yet. I think it's really interesting that lots of adolescents are fully willing to say, nah, drinking isn't for me. And, I absolutely love that. I also, however, still am worried. I used to not be worried about vaping at all. But what I'm hearing from recovery centers now, especially for adolescents, is that it used to be pretty rare for adolescents to come in and have big time nicotine addictions. And now it's more common than not. So, and since nicotine is such a difficult addiction to kick, it can complicate the addictions they're having to other things as well. Nicotine addiction is a very real thing. The delivery methods for both cannabis and nicotine, when you're vaping or when you're using, much stronger strains than were available when my parents were young and in the, using weed in the 70s, that kind of stuff. It's just a very different world. And the substances that our kids have access to are more sort of, I don't want to say chemically pure, but they're much stronger. And it's not, the weed of today is not the same thing as the weed of our parents smoked.
What do you do if you are trying to help your kids stop vaping? Because I think it can be the gateway drug, because they're introducing nicotine to their body that they don't realize that they're actually bringing on an addictive chemical into their body. Jackie has a question about her child and how she can help her child stop vaping.
Yeah. So the interesting question is, you have to start with the why, right? So there's this great, fantastic quote I love from Chris Herron. I quote him he was a former Boston Celtic. He is in recovery, speaks at a lot of schools. And one of the things he says that I really love is, we love to talk so much about the last day, like the war stories around me getting drunk at my mom's birthday party, but we need to talk about the first day. Why is a kid picking up in the first place? And for vaping, there is a lot of pressure culturally because it's kind of cool. And there's all these trends around different vaping tools that kids can use.
The flavors are really all of that.
And not only the flavors, but I mean, the reality is nicotine works. I mean, nicotine is an incredible drug for mental acuity. Caffeine is a drug. I have it right here. I'm not giving it up because it's all I got left, but it is a great drug.
To that. I've got my caffeine here with you.
So I think, when you have a kid that's using nicotine, one of the big questions is, why are you doing it? And, then we have to start thinking about, well, what kind of messages are we sending our kids about why we use the drugs that we use? And even if that's alcohol and we're saying, oh man, I had the worst day at work. I just need a drink. Or we're going to grandma's house for Thanksgiving and there better be enough wine because this is going to be a long day. So if the message we're sending our kid is, I have this emotion I don't like, I drink at it. My answer is to drink at it. Then that message so when people say, well, can I drink in front of my kids or should I not drink in front of my kids? I'm like, well, I'm never going to tell you not to drink in your kids unless you have alcohol use disorder, in which case you need to really look at that. But I'm really concerned about the messages we send our kids about why we drink or why we
That's
use
good.
weed or why we smoke cigarettes. If we could start looking at that, then that'll go a long way toward helping us think about the whys that our kids might be using and having conversations about that why specifically. If it's because they're tired all the time, then we really need to start thinking about the fact that most teenagers are sleep deprived. You know, they're getting nowhere near the amount of sleep that they need to get. And in our house, you know, there's a lot of things I'll let slide, but getting an hour of exercise a day outside and getting enough sleep, those were two non-negotiables in our house. That was just the priority in our house. Yeah. So having that why conversation is super important.
That's good.
So what is your thought on if you as a parent have a different view on how you look at alcohol in your home? Maybe your wife or your husband thinks it's okay to drink around your kids or to drink with your kids, and it's a kind of a divided household. How would you advise a parent in that situation?
This is such a difficult situation to be put in. I talk to parents all the time. Now you're stuck with having to like educate your spouse as well, or your ex-spouse, as well as trying to educate your kids. But when it comes down to it, you can't change other people's behavior. I mean, if I learned anything in recovery, it's that I can't make anyone else see the world the way I do or get them sober. I can only worry about the way I handle things. So when it comes down to it, worry about the modeling that you're doing with your kids and the conversations that you're having with your kids. There's so many issues that come up around, you know, two parents seeing parenting issues different ways. There are great books. You know, I can recommend that you gift your spouse or your ex-spouse, my book. I've even inscribed things into the book that make it seem less like an attack on, like you're doing it wrong and I'm doing it right. No judgment, not a you're doing it wrong, I'm doing it right. But I learned some stuff when I read this book. And is it okay if I tell you about it so that maybe we can sort of be on the same page about this? This is something that's it's so difficult to do. But if you come from it from a place of, I was doing the best I could based on the information I had, I learned some new information and now I want to do better, not you're doing it wrong, let me fix you, then you stand a much better chance of getting them to hear you.
We had a lot of questions, Jess, and that's such a great answer. A lot of questions about parents who think that they're creating a safe space by allowing their children to drink underage in their home because they know that they're not going to get behind the wheel of a car. They're not going to harm anybody. They're not going to get roofied, right? So what do you say to that parent? And the parent also who might have a kid that's going off to college and they're like, well, they're going to be drinking in college anyway. Right. What do you say to that parent that has created that kind of atmosphere? And I'll be honest, I don't know how I feel about it. What do you say to them? What does the research say about what that's actually doing? Is it preventing their children from getting in harm's way and from drinking more when they go off to college?
Night? Absolutely. Yeah. That night while they're locked in your house and you have their keys, absolutely. It's keeping them safer. But from a long-term perspective, no, you're actually increasing not just your child's risk for developing substance use disorder, but also if you're involving your kids' friends, you're raising their risk as well. And peer cohort and what kids are doing with their peers is a big part of this question, and it's also illegal. So, from my perspective as a parent, if you're involving my children in that, I'm out, and I will, I'll do what I need to do to keep my kids safe. But for the parent who's instigating it, no, you're not keeping your kids safer. You're actually showing them that you have a permissive stance on drugs and alcohol, and you're not protecting them. You're actually raising your kids' risk of developing substance use disorder.
And then Cindy wants to know, how do we deal with those parents who are permissive? Our children are being invited to their home. It's prom season or it's summertime. Like, how do we as parents handle that permissive parent, right?
Yeah. So the bravest thing I've ever seen was Tina Payne Bryson, who writes with Dan Siegel. She's brilliant. She's amazing. When the addiction inoculation first came out, she bought enough copies for the parents of her kids' friends and said, come on over for breakfast. Let's talk about this because we are parenting each other's children. We know that the parents of your kids' friends are also in on this whole parenting the kids thing. And she actually said, just so you know, our stance based on the information information in this book is that no, not until your brain is done developing. And so therefore your kids coming to my house, I will not be offering alcohol. There will be no alcohol around your kids when they are at my house. And this would be the ideal for me based on the evidence that's in this book. And by the way, the Research Society on Alcohol just gave me their 2023 Media Award for this book because it is accurate to the evidence that's out there around prevention. And so that's a super brave thing to do. I gave her tons of kudos for that. But, if that's not the way you want to go, there's a couple of pages in the book that are excuses adolescents gave me that are really inventive for things they can say if they don't want to use, but they also want to save face. And some of them are things like, oh, I'm gluten-free and I can't have beer, or I'm taking antibiotics and therefore I can't drink alcohol, or I have a sleep disorder and therefore I can't drink alcohol. So if we're asking our teens to be brave and to use their words in order to say no when they're out at like a party, then we have to be a little bit brave and say to the parents of their friends, you know what? Just so you know, in our home, our rules are no, not until your brain is done developing. That doesn't happen until they're sort of, let's say it's early to mid 20s, but even if you want to just say 21, even if you want to just say 18. And so I would really appreciate it if those rules could apply at your house as well. And
that's great.
Does it take some bravery?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely takes some bravery. But that's why it was so scary for me to move my daughter in between middle school and high school, is I had that exact conversation with my daughter's two best friends' parents. Here's what we do in our home. I'm an alcoholic. My kid's at increased risk. I would really appreciate it if these were the rules in your home too, at least when my daughter is there.
Yeah, but those uncomfortable questions are 100% worth it because these are our kids. We've got to protect our kids and raise those kids the right way.
The more often we have uncomfortable conversations, the more comfortable they become. Are there things that are still uncomfortable for us to talk about in our house? Like, whether it's porn or sex or whatever? Absolutely. But the more often we talk about these things, the easier those conversations become.
Oh, this has been so good. Jess, where can people find you, stay in contact with you? Can you give us all the information?
Sure. JessicaLahey.com has just everything. And one of the things that's there that's been really fun is every day for the past, 2 years, I've been doing these daily videos in my Instagram Reels, but there's linked index under videos at JessicaLahey.com for all of those videos, whether they're gift of failure or the addiction inoculation. And they're only 90 seconds long. So they're like little bite-sized chunks of information on, very particular questions, like many of the questions you just asked.
And that's Lahey, Lahey.
Lahey, yes. Thank you.
Thank you for having this uncomfortable conversation with us. But it's so important, like you said, that we just talk about it. Thank you, Jessica. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it. We're going to link to Jessica's book in the show notes, but some things that really stood out to me, John, is the way that we can have these conversations with our children. Hey, you cannot have this until your brain is done developing, and here's why. So laying out the facts. And then when she said that not as many kids are drinking and using as we think, that's a statistic I was not aware of.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to point that out to our kids. Not as many kids are doing it as you actually think, but then there's that peer pressure and then that feeling that they have to match the level of their peers and then some.
Yeah, our kids will go extreme on us and say everybody's doing this or nobody's doing this, and it's just not the facts. And if you really look at the facts, those were some of my biggest takeaways, and everything she talked about was really grounded in statistics and research. And the biggest thing for me was just the physiological damage that it can do to teenagers who aren't fully developed. Their brain isn't fully developed. It's not ready until your potential, I think you said mid-20s before your brain really is fully developed, and you aren't going to have any effects of alcohol or substance abuse.
Yeah, not until your brain is done developing. And here's why: just rooting everything in statistics instead of rooting it into hearsay. And as she said, alcohol is much more dangerous to the adolescent brain. And explain to them what it's actually doing to their brain is really powerful. Speaking of what it's doing to their brain, or maybe not, John, a really funny couple of episodes are coming up around the corner with David Thomas. He is an adolescent therapist, and he's going to tell us how we can relate to our teen and tween boys. And something that really stood out to me, and I can't wait for you to hear this, John, is that scientifically proven that when you get more than a couple of boys in the same room, collectively their IQ goes down, which it just makes everything make so much more sense now. After I heard
that's not just science. I've actually done experiments on that. Not by design, but yes, pretty much my entire life when me and my group of friends get together, our IQ does collectively go down.
So it relates not just to tween and teen boys, but to grown men as well. But can't wait for you guys to listen to that conversation again, something that you have been requesting. We're going to be answering your questions about how to relate to your tween and teen boys. We also have a conversation coming up about how you can create the life that you love, which is something, John, I think we've done it. There's a lot of sacrifices involved, but
we're trying every day.
Every single day, it is a journey. Yes. All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Happy Mother's Day. John, I'll be looking for my gift.
It's in the mail. I know it's in the mail because I ordered it this morning.
Okay. You're so good. All right. Thanks for talking about it, John. And everybody, thank you for tuning in, and we will continue to talk about it on the show. I know you guys thought you were done with me, but not quite yet. I have one more thing to tell you about. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to subscribe to the show. I don't want you to miss a single beat or a single conversation. And remember, my DMs are always open. Tell me what you want to talk about.